Tá ótimo, Marcos.
Okay, ready.
Okay. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you once again for being with us here tonight and this morning. This webinar is the second on a series of talks on the directions of the Chinese economy and foreign policy today. The topic of today's discussion is the direction and reform of China's financial system, including the launching of the new digital currency. We have the pleasure of having with us very interesting speakers. I want to thank very much Yan Lang, CEO for Greater China of Lazare, for taking time from her super busy schedule to be with us today. I also thank Ambassador Karamuru for his special participation and Karen Vasquez for her comments. Yan Lang is now very well known to the Brazilian audience, and it is the second time that we have the pleasure to have her speak at CEBRI. Her presentations are always followed with great interest by the financial community of Brazil and CEBRI's committed stakeholders. I would like to highlight that in addition to being the CEO of Lazare for Greater China, my dear friend Yan Lang is also an author of a magnificent book on her experiences of growing up in China. The book, Chez les Young, originally published in French, has also an English version, all available in Amazon. And we very much hope that he might have a Portuguese version someday. The book gives an ample historical scope, which goes from China's foundation until today. Ambassador Karamuru, a member of CEBRI's council, is known to all, and he will be conducting this conversation with Yan Lang, with comments from Karen Vasquez. Each participant will have 30 minutes for Ms. Yan Lang, 20 minutes for Ambassador Karamuru, and 10 minutes for Karen Vasquez. In addition to being our former ambassador in Beijing, Marcos Karamuru has also been a keen observer of China's economy and finance for more than 20 years, and an important advisor to the Brazilian business community with investments in China. Karen Vasquez, our commentator, is a scholar at Fudan University and assistant dean of Jidao Global University. What motivated our choice of topic today is the important changes undergoing in China's financial system. Changes which in many ways do not detract from the continuous preoccupation of China of maintaining an important public arm in the financial sector and a system which guarantees both reserves and budgetary provisions to finance its large investments in economic development. Equally important, innovation developments, which are a vital part of the 14 five-year plan. Notwithstanding this continuous commitment with maintaining a public sector capable of responding to investment targets, important reforms are taking place in the financial system, and understanding its causes and prime movers is the task of our conversation today. A few words in the context of these reforms are important. Firstly, China has recovered best among all central economies from the COVID crisis, with a growth of 2.3 already in 2020, and probably expected to grow around 8% in 2021. While its investments abroad declined in the context of the COVID context, plus the conflictual relations with the US and its numerous externalities, FDI into China has been on the rise and surpasses those to the US. FDI increased by 24.8 as compared to 2019, excluding the financial sector. 10,263 foreign enterprises have entered China, an increase of 47.8 year on year, according to the China Briefing Group. There was a surge of 51% from 2020 in service industries and 32.1 on high-tech sector, which goes to show that the thesis of decoupling has its limits when it comes to the attractiveness of the Chinese market and the ties already existing between enterprises active in China. Many things have contributed to this investment scenario. Changes in the negative list of China, with an important decrease in items banned, an important trade agreement signed by China of note, the Regional Comprehensive Partnership, which involved Asian countries plus Japan, Korea, Australia, and others to come, and the EU-China Investment Agreement, all created important facilitations for the operation of foreign firms in China's financial sector. Yan Lang will address extensively these issues. On the internal front, the dual circulation economy, drafted as an instrument to counterbalance external upheavals, is coupled with an increase in internal investments of such nature that some authors have called the Chinese state today the venture capital state. There are myriads of investment instruments and targets directed to the innovation sector, which give a measure of how China is reacting to the backlash of the US-China conflict and its externalities. These positive measures were also followed by new rules which aim at disciplining the operation of the system itself, greater control of the capital and bond market, and of the financial operation of the fintechs, which, as elsewhere, had developed large financial sectors and eventually could bypass the operation of public banks where traditional Chinese savings are held. The reason and modality of control of the fintechs are complex. On the one hand, they represent the shining stars of the Chinese e-commerce and service economy. On the other, they progressively escape the control of the state and regulation in their financial operations. Finally, in an already exceedingly digital economy, the Chinese central bank decides to launch a digital currency. Measures which, while opening up the system in a more controlled manner, also guarantee the operation and health of the financial public sector, and on the long run may contribute to the internationalization of the renminbi, which has been sluggish, and increase as well the payment transactions of Chinese investments abroad. In this opening up, coupled with reform and continuity, it is this opening up, coupled with reform and continuity, which makes the Chinese system unique. There are, of course, growing problems to be tackled in the fiscal side, the regulation of the capital market, struggles which are not new, but which increase in importance with the large investments being made. Understanding the meanders of these changes is what inspired our talk today. So this is a context that I wanted to give you And I will not take much more time, but pass the floor to my dear friend Yan Lang, which will have a presentation and give her impressions on all of these issues mentioned before. Yan Lang, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to also thank you, CEBRI, to invite me to join this discussion today. And I noticed, Anna, you have already made a wonderful and very comprehensive introduction about the topic we will discuss today. So on my part, I'd like to share with you my view on 4 following topics. Let me just show some slides. Yeah, so as Anna mentioned, so we will talk about reforms and the opening of China financial system. So first of all, I like to talk with few minutes about the China economic update this year. So you can see on this page, we gave some indications about this year economic situation. So the first quarter of this year, 2021, the record growth of 18.3% in real GDP comparison with last year. This was quite normal because last year, on the same time, the first quarter, China was hit heavily by the pandemic. But you can see here showing you some indication of PMI, service PMI, first quarter in China, and manufacturing PMI. All this indication, the figures show the Chinese economy has generally undergone resilient recovery. One point I like to emphasize, in first, Anna already mentioned last year, but this year the trends continue to be so. That is the FDI, foreign direct investment, into China, mainland China, increased almost 40% for the first quarter of this year. So if we look at the main tasks, main missions, or main objectives announced by Chinese government for this year, we can see all these measures quite in detail, fiscal policy to help the small and medium-sized companies for their recovery, and then emphasizing innovation, environmental, etc. education. But what I would like to say, and I mentioned this year, the GDP could be around 8%. The Chinese government show more reserved attitude. They target the GDP of this year at around 6%. But they are also to create 11 million new jobs in urban area. This is very important. And also the CPI control, the Chinese government said it should be at 3%. So you can see, in fact, the China reform, you can see more clearly the next step of China reform in this 14th five-year plan. The five-year plan is very important in China. And you can, when you read it, you will more or less know where China will be in 5 years. And so exactly last year in May, Chinese government launched the new strategy consists of dual circulation economy, right? So this dual circulation compose internal reform and external opening. We can see, in fact, in this 5-year plan, first of all, now China focus on internal circulation. That means they will develop the huge China domestic market by supply side and as well as by demand side. So from supply side reform, they emphasize on science and innovation. So they will continue to develop an increase in R&D, expanding established national science and technology project in AI, some very precise sectors, and on the same time strengthen the IP protection in this field. And they also announce the great plan for upgrade manufacturing and technology. So this is very important. And you may notice in all these details, they will build within these 5 years a national-wide integrated data center system. And they will promote smart, automate, digital, networked manufacturing. So regarding the consumption side, demand side. So first of all, they will increase the urbanization rate. After 5 years, this rate will reach 65% and create much more interaction and movement between rural and urban. And develop smart city in the satellite city around the big cities. On the same time, they will provide strong support for infrastructure in rural country and make this movement possible and easy between countryside, remote countryside, and cities. Of course, there are other sectors they emphasize, put on priority. They are just like here listed in the health sector, education sector, and also in environmental sector. So all these sectors, they have precise objective to be reached. Of course, we said it's dual circulation. That means they emphasize the domestic market development, but on the same time, they will still keep open China, attract international investment on China market, increase the import goods from abroad. So this is, and then they continue to emphasize the investment on one Belt, One Road countries. So for all this, to reach all these goals and the targets, of course, one of the important tool is financial reform. So we will come later on this financial sector opening, and they will improve financial inclusion, build a modern central banking system, also by using digital currency, etc. We will discuss it in detail for the next topic. But of course, China has key challenge today. The key challenge, the most big challenge is China-US relationship, as Anna already mentioned. So I just resume this situation between China, US, we can say the new normals between China, US can be resumed in 3C, the confrontation in certain sectors, competition, as well as cooperation. So when we talk about cooperation, that means, for example, we think about climate change. We do hope also in public health, we can strengthen the cooperation for the common interests of the world. Second challenge still remains for China, it's a pandemic control. The pandemic control in China, as you know, the pandemic control since 1 year, it's in the very stable situation, and due to this good pandemic control, domestic market, business, and the manufacturing already come back, right? With 2.3% GDP growth last year. But one thing is China still a closed country. The closed in the sense that China, well, today we don't have well, so much international traffic. Very few international flights allow to, you know, to open, to arrive in China. And when you come to China for the international travelers, businessmen, you need at least to have 14 days confinement in a hotel before you can be, get your freedom of movement. So this certainly impacted business sector, and we do hope with successful vaccination in the country and the other countries, we will hopefully have more possibility, even think about vaccination visa with the maybe bilateral discussion with countries to allow more international traveling. So today, with the successful control of pandemic situation in China, the vaccination is still quite low, around 20% only. Other challenge we can mention here, it's for example, increasing corporate bonds default. We see in 2020, it's reached 30 billion USD. And of course, the big issue in China is the Chinese debt to GDP. Last year, it's already reached almost 30%, 300%, precisely 294%. That's comparison with GDP. It's very high level. It's a significant leverage concentrated in SOEs, provincial and local government. This is a big challenge, and Chinese government need to gradually manage and reduce this ratio. And another question or challenge is the Chinese labor costs keep increasing. So it's losing the competitiveness on the labor cost in comparison with the Southeast Asia with neighbors. The last one, but not the least, challenge is aging population. As you know, recently we just made announced the national census, right? So in this, the latest 10 years national census, it's indicate the birth rate, it's very low. It's only 1.3% comparison with other countries, developed countries or developing countries. So this shows certainly the trend that Chinese society is going toward aging society. And this will also impact largely Chinese economic development direction in the near 10, 20 years. So next topic, I will talk very briefly about financial service industry opening. Since 1 year and a half, Chinese government, Chinese authority announced a series of regulation rules and which are removing and lifting the ownership limits on the Chinese financial institutions for foreign investors, such as bank, security firm, asset management, etc. And the latest one is the Chinese central bank jointly announced, remove the quota restriction on 2 inbound investment scheme, QFII and RQFII. So this is encourage the international investors to participate, to be able to invest directly without quota in China onshore bonds and stock market. So this page show you concretely who are already in China since 2 years or 1 year and a half with Chinese policy changing in financial sectors. We can see in security firm, we have 100% or majority owned by foreign investors as Goldman, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Credit Suisse, just name it. And in the fund management company, BlackRock, JP Morgan already there, holding either 100% their company in China or majority more than 51%. For the bank, it's we just gave example ANG, who has a joint venture with the Beijing Bank, owns more than 51% shares in the bank. Insurance sector is very popular. So they have already insurance company in non-life sector, 100% or in the joint venture, the foreign investors, foreign insurer holds majority shareholding. And life insurance sector, it's also very popular today. Quite a lot of foreign investors looking and talking and negotiating in the sector to have the majority owned by foreign capital, foreign insurance for life insurance business in China. This is booming and has a lot of potentials. With this more than 1.4 billion people here. And wealth management company, we can see the names as Amundi, Goldman, Temasek team up with BlackRock, set up joint venture with the Chinese commercial banks. Amundi is with the China Bank of China. So they set up a joint venture in which Amundi holds 65% majority. On the payment front, so the American Express and others already set up a joint venture and hold more than 50% of equity. So you can see all this incoming foreign specialists in their sector will certainly, first of all, bring large capital in China by setting up joint ventures or setting up their 100% companies in China. And the most important for the Chinese authorities' intention is to, by opening the financial sector, so they will introduce the know-how of the foreign specialists in this sector, and also the better management skill, of course, improve, most importantly, the corporate governance of the company, and promote differentiation development in the financial service sector, which should respond the huge development in China. And the authority has also, the concerns, not only the authority, the Chinese SOEs in the banking sector. So the competition, when you open the sector, the competition will come in, right? Will be strong. So they could maybe affect their profitability today, because they are still the state-owned bank are still on monopoly situation. And with the new designed product, so they certainly can bring potential risks, and also some risk on out of control of credit expansion. Talking about credit expansion issue, so the Chinese financial authority is more concerned by the Chinese booming fintech activities. So give you an example, you may already read in the newspaper this case of Ant Group IPO. Ant Group is Alibaba-owned financial fintech platform. Last year in October, Ant Group announced they will make a dual listing in Shanghai and in Hong Kong, armed world largest IPO of 35 billion USD. But in November, so Ant was asked to suspend their IPO because they didn't get approval from Chinese authority. What is the reason? The reason is, in fact, Chinese authority noticed Ant apply for a fintech listing. But in fact, not only Ant Group, but other financing tech fintech company use their online small loan license to circumvent leverage restriction by issuing loans, joint loans, and carry out unlimited lending. So this is worrisome for Chinese regulators, because of the booming online micro lending sector backed by those fintech company became the key concern due to the risk of excessive leverage. So as a result, Chinese regulators announced new rule to require the fintech company should fund no less than 30% of total loans. It was only less than 2% before. So you can see the very strict control on the leverage risk. So today, Ant Group still under the restructuring of their business phase before they can apply, they can get approval for Chinese banking authority for their IPO. And the last topic I want to mention quickly, it's the digital currency in China. Today, in fact, all in the world, 80% of central banks are thinking, are studying, doing the research, if they are not yet launched the pilot project for the, we call the central bank digital currency. On China side, they start very early. You can see this map, this roadmap to show Chinese central bank started a research group already in 2014, 8 years ago. And then gradually they advanced their regulatory environment and setting up the technical platform, and the key timing is April 2020 here. They launched their digital payment system trial project in 4 cities. So Chinese digital renminbi, we say e-renminbi pilot program started last year in Shenzhen, Suzhou, Chengdu, and Xiong'an. It's a city next to Beijing. And a lot of companies, even international companies like McDonald's, Subway, Starbucks joined this pilot project. So today, the situation is the Chinese central bank are also talking, working with Hong Kong MA Monetary Authority, Macau, and to test eventually the cross-border payment with them by digital renminbi. And the next step is very soon. So the renminbi trial will enlarge to more cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Great Bay Area. And so the all nationwide rollout by next year, that means within 1 year, 2020 and 2023. So the key feature of e-renminbi, of course, they provide a lot of advantage. Easy to use, and also the efficiency for settlement, and no price volatility because they are equal to the physical renminbi, and it's easy use, likely to compare with Alipay and WeChat Pay, and with maybe the higher security function. So all that gave us thought, I think that it will be very easy to develop and to be used in large scale domestically in China. So the key implication for this e-renminbi is in the short term, Chinese authority, PBOC, it's only arming to use it partially to replace physical currency in the domestic market. And of course, it will provide significant opportunity for saving the cost for especially during the B2B transaction, and improve payment efficiency, lower transaction costs, and increase Chinese financial efficiency, integration, etc. Of course, also increase the Chinese authorities' surveillance on the movement of the flow of the capital. So by this big data. So in the long run, I think it's interesting, of course, to think about this wide PBOC try to work with Hong Kong and Macau to see cross-border payment by digital renminbi. First step with Hong Kong and Macau, and then we will see it will certainly help, but it's not immediate purpose for Chinese government to renminbi internationalization. Maybe the first step is with the country today, with the country who signed agreement with China on bilateral trade settlement by renminbi instead of a physical renminbi, maybe use digital. Or this could be a scenario. But anyway, I think today the digital economy in China represent 36% of the total GDP. And in 2030, so it will be 50% of GDP. So I think this e-currency, digital renminbi, in certain sense, it also answer. It's one of the answer for this Chinese expansion, rapid expansion of digital economy. So I pause there. We can discuss for the question, if you like, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Lang, for giving us this wonderful presentation. Also with details that we have no way of having access here. So especially, I thank you for that. And I pass the floor to Ambassador Marcos Caramuru. Marcos, you have the floor, and I am sorry for the digital difficulties that you're facing. But your brightness will surpass everything.
Well, thank you very much. Yalan, I first want to say that I'm very glad to participate in this debate with you and to see you again and talking to the Brazilian audience once more. The second thing is that you made a wonderful presentation, a very comprehensive presentation that gives us a broad picture of the main topics in the Chinese economy today. And it's not an easy presentation because it's very vast, but at the same time, you were able to summarize and touch the very important points in each one of these topics. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make comments on each one of the topics that you mentioned. But I'll do my comments trying to offer you and offer the audience the view of a Brazilian about these topics. How do we believe that these topics would have an interference in our reality? What would we pay attention to as a lesson, and how we would look towards the future, having in mind all the topics that you mentioned. First of all, on the economy, on the recovery of the Chinese economy, I think it's very reassuring that the Chinese economy is recovering very well. And you mentioned that in the first quarter we had a growth of 18%, and everybody believes that growth will at the end of the year will reach 8 to 8.5%. I think the US, which is an economy that is going to grow reasonably successfully this year, is going to grow 4 to 4.5%. So China is showing its robustness. And when you look at all the data, and you mentioned some of them, PMI over 50%, fixed asset investments are going up, retail sales are going up, industrial output is going up, unemployment is decreasing, real estate is showing a strong demand. So when we look at the whole economy, you see, yes, the conditions are there to produce this growth around 8 to 8.5%. The questions we have are the following. First, how China is going to withdraw the support it has given to small and medium-sized companies and to the private sector, to the business sector in general after the pandemic. I have noticed that there are two things going on in the Chinese economy. The first one is fiscal flows are flowing more straightforwardly from the central government to the local government. And there was a decision, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago by the State Council to eliminate all the steps that fiscal flows had to follow in terms of all the organs that the State Council and the provincial instances and all that, they are flowing more directly to guarantee the use of resources at the end of the line. The second thing is that the central bank, in my view, is starting to withdraw some of the obligation of banks to provide this support to small and medium-sized companies. I saw a decision recently by the central bank increasing to the banks to increase loan loss provisioning, and at the same time to stop the increase of new financing to companies in China. So I see things working in these two directions. And I think the whole world is going to be observing
whether these elections are going to work well or not. I think China was very smart in not approving a big package when COVID-19 started to affect all the economies, but they gave support to the companies and they gave a number of advantages in terms of reduction in taxes and all that. So this movement now that is going on, which is the withdrawal of support, I think the whole world is going to be following. And in a certain way, it's going to be a lesson for the rest of the world, because the rest of the world will also have to go through a kind of, reduction of the subsidies and support that was given. This is the one point that we will all pay attention to. The second point has to do with this whole concept of dual circulation, which is a concept which is very much based on the idea of strengthening the local market in China and in a certain way, making China much more focused on its own reality, on its own local market. You mentioned the fact that FDI has been increasing, which is, very significant, and the increase is very high. Not that long ago, we were talking about decoupling of the economies. Now you see FDI increasing at very high rates, isn't it? But we see ODI decreasing. Overseas investments by Chinese companies have decreased 5% in the first quarter. So there's a movement of investments going in, but a smaller amount of investments going out. It's understandable in a certain way, because most economies have not yet recovered from COVID-19. So the space for new investments in China abroad is in a way reduced. But there is always this question, what's going to happen at last? Is China going to attract more investments and be less worried about exporting investments, or we are going to see the previous reality of the Chinese companies investing heavily abroad, as they did in the last 10 years. Well, this for Latin America is very important, and also for Brazil, because there are many new opportunities in Latin America for investments in infrastructure, investment in many segments and services and all that. And I think there is a big expectation in the markets here that the flow of ODI, foreign investment China from China to Brazil or to Latin America would be kept. So in a way, we follow this concept of dual circulation with a big question mark in our minds. Is it what's going to happen? Are we going to see a more closed economy in China, attracting more investments, exporting less capital, or we are going to see the opportunities that existed in the past? So this is my comment about the economy in general. Your second point was about this very new factor of the opening up of the financial services industry in China. This is, in my view, one of the most important, if not the most important piece of news in the international economy recently. Because we have seen that, and you showed very clearly all the funds, the American funds and financial institutions now settling down in China by themselves without the obligation of a joint venture with Chinese companies, or in some cases with a joint venture, but they keep the majority of capital. This is a big change in the Chinese reality, and it responds to the appetite of banks and funds in the States mainly, and also in Europe and also in other countries to invest in China, in the Chinese reality. After all, if China is going to grow at 8 to 8.5%, the opportunities for investments in the equity market, in the bond market, in securities market are going to be there. And even Brazilian institutions now look at the Chinese market and they say, gee, well, if this is the future of some of these main important, of these big funds, US funds and others, not the future, the present, because actually they say that there is already $1 trillion in investments in the stock market, in securities issued by Chinese companies or the treasury and deposits. Now, this is going to increase a lot. And also the markets also in the emerging market economies are going to be paying attention to this and would be very anxious to follow the big funds in the Chinese reality. And we look at this with a sense of hope. But there are two issues connected to this that we cannot ignore. The first is the fact that China is going to have much stricter follow-up of market practices. Market practices in China will have to improve in order to give confidence for these funds to be there. There's a learning curve. I think China has already shown new developments and important developments, but this means that the challenge for the Chinese authorities to keep the market practices really compatible with international practices in the equity market and the bond market are going to be there, and everybody is going to follow what China is going to do with that. But the second challenge is a challenge for the emerging markets as a whole, because if we are going to see a reality in which portfolio funds are going to flow heavily to the Chinese reality, in a way, China is going to compete with emerging markets, because we always are in the need to attract these capitals to our own reality, isn't it? Well, if interest rates raise in the United States, part of these funds are going to be in the US, you see, and will go naturally to the protection of the US reality. But nobody expects that interest rates are going to increase in the US in the short run. So what we are going to see is that flows are going to China, heavily going to China. But what's going to happen with flows coming from developing countries, from emerging market countries? Will China compete with emerging market countries or not? Will there be a space for emerging market countries to attract some of these funds? Yes, there will be, but it's going to be complicated. First, because mature economies will be financing their fiscal deficits, the deficits they have to accumulate to deal with COVID-19. The second thing, China is going to attract capital because of growth in the Chinese economy. And then the question is, will there be capital enough to flow to emerging market economies? And when we see this reality in the long run, we also have additional questions, because China apparently is going to go from a current account with strong deficits in the last 10, 20 years with strong surpluses in the last few decades to current accounts that are going to show a deficit in their own reality. So in a way, China will have to attract capital to finance these current account deficits. China having current account deficits also means that emerging market economies may have current account surpluses, because commodity prices will be high, they will be exporting a lot to China, they will need less resources to finance the current account deficits. But still, the flow of portfolio investments to emerging market economies is a very important point. And the question mark is, we will see China as a competitor, or we will still occupy a space, and generate appetite in more developed in these funds and fund managers to invest in our reality. My third point is your point about fintechs. I think we all followed with a lot of attention what happened with the market in fintechs in China. First, no regulation, an enormous increase in the number of fintechs. Many of them went bust. Then the regulators came and started to micromanage the fintechs, and the number of fintechs was considerably reduced in China. And then you have new problems, such as the one that you described. Those who survived because they were very efficient and very strong, like Ant Finance, isn't it? They started to explore new areas, like the insurance areas and new areas and all that. And at some point, the regulators in China said, you have to stop there. So all of us who 5 years ago or 3 years ago looked at the fintech development in China saying, gee, this is the future. You know, they are increasing very fast. They are going to be there. We saw, you know, a complete change in this reality. And now we saw a new change in the regulation of fintechs that are very strong and are very successful. So there's a lesson for the emerging market economies, because we are now starting to develop fintechs in our own reality. And I think that the main lesson is perhaps we should regulate from scratch. From the very beginning, we should take care of regulation. And then we are going to see a more stable reality than the reality that we saw in China. But in a way, we lost the North. We lost the experience that was available there in China, you see. And some of us will have to go by our own efforts, dealing with our own reality. But this is a very interesting example of a topic in which China allowed the market to go by itself without any regulation. At a certain point, China started to regulate. Regulation was excessive, and then the market really lost the vitality that it had in the past. So when one looks at our own reality in terms of fintechs, one looks at the experience of China as well. And we ask ourselves, what's going to be the future and how we can organize the future in a solid and healthy way. My last comment is about the digital currency. I think it's a very extraordinary fact that China is ahead of everyone else developing its own digital currency. China already had a digital currency, but it was very much associated with WeChat or with Alibaba, isn't it? And now they are creating a digital currency that the banks are going to be involved with it. And my perception is that the banks themselves had a problem with the fact that there was so much concentration in this market, and the regulators in China decided to give a response, a positive response to involve the banks as well. But I think the aspect that we are all going to pay attention to is the one that you also mentioned in your presentation. What's the future of these digital currencies going internationally? And China is going to be the first country where the digital currency is going to go internationally. And we have already seen the central bank starting to make agreements for the use of the Chinese digital yuan with other countries. And I've seen a very interesting agreement as well, which is the agreement between the authorities in China and the SWIFT. SWIFT is the system of transfer of funds internationally, you see, which is in a way very much dominated by the United States, although SWIFT is a company, you know, with the participation of many countries established in Europe. But the system is very much dominated by the United States. And in a way, we see that the new steps in China as a way to getting free from the system in the United States. And I paid a lot of attention to this agreement they made with a joint venture, actually, that they created with SWIFT, because for them, it was important to get the technology of SWIFT and create a system, thinking about the internationalization of the digital currency to create a system that was reliable. And I asked myself, what's the interest of SWIFT in this? The interest of SWIFT was to learn with the experience of China with the digital currency, because it's going to be the first one. So we see China very much, leading a whole new reality in terms of digital currencies. But the main question that we entertain is that what's going to be the steps? What are the steps China is going to take to internationalize its digital currency in a certain way to reduce the force of the SWIFT system if countries start to use digital currencies, and create a world in which there will be less influence of the United States and on the system which is dominated by the dollar and the international banks? This is a very important question. And I think that everyone who follows the international market will have to focus on that. So what you said, this whole presentation that you made, raised me these questions about, what's going on in China today have to do with the international economy. It's impossible not to pay attention. And it's impossible either not to be directly affected, as in the case of the portfolio flows, will the emerging markets be affected, or looking at the experiences and seeing where the world is going next. So we look at these topics as with a sense of saying that the future, in a way, starts to be designed by China, and we will have to pay more and more attention to that. Be certain that the financial institutions in Brazil have a strong eye on this reality, have a very attentive eye on this reality. And all of us who follow the Chinese economy will have to follow this very, very much in detail in order not to lose, the design of the future that is already in front of us. Having said that, thank you very much for your presentation. It was brilliant, and it was very interesting because it raised so many points that have to be discussed, by everyone at this stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marcos, for your brilliant and very thorough comments on Yan Lang's presentation. I think we could go on and on this exchange of views for a very long time, and maybe we can do it again. But in the meantime, I would like to pass the floor to Karen Vasquez for her comments, because we then are coming close to the end of our meeting, and I would like very much to hear what she has to say on this extremely interesting exchange of opinions. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank Yan Lang for the brilliant presentation. Just to use the same adjective as others have been using, I couldn't be less emphatic on the excellency that you covered so many important topics. But I would also like to thank CEBRI in the person of Anna and Marcos and José Pio for inviting me to this event, and greet all of those watching us online today for me here in China. I would like to make some brief comments on the 2 points that are discussed here. One, the opening, and the second on the reform of China's financial sector. And I think, as Marcos pointed, also what it means for us in Brazil. First on the opening, listen to Yan Lang got me thinking of when China joined the WTO back in 2001. And many people thought that foreign banks would flow into the country. But what we saw was actually the share of foreign banks in the Chinese market dropping instead of increasing. So then the question is, if pressure has been there for the past 2 decades, why is China opening its financial sector only in the past 2 years? Many reforms have happened in the past decades for sure, but why is it accelerating right now? And there are perhaps at least two points here. First, because careful opening ensures stability, and as we know, stability is very important to Chinese leaders, and this is possibly what explains why China did not have any major financial hiccup even during the last global financial crisis in 2008. And perhaps a second explanation is that now, unlike before, China is more interested to accelerate the opening of its financial sector because, as Yan Lang touched on this point, greater competition could increase efficiency in Chinese financial sector. As we know, financial system in China is growing bigger and bigger each year, but also has many challenges. And one of these challenges is that the market is still dominated by a few super banks with monopoly-like power and relatively low innovation. And more foreign banks or financial institutions coming into China could lead to better products and more efficient resource allocation. But also another challenge that was mentioned by Ambassador Karamuru is that government imposed restrictions on Chinese private banks and fintechs specifically. And Alibaba and Tencent, for example, they cannot offer online bank accounts for their clients, despite having the platforms, despite having the clients, a huge client base. If these restrictions are not imposed on foreign banks, they could potentially offer these online bank accounts to clients of these Chinese fintechs through using their platforms and without having the cost or the burden to set up branches themselves, right? And a second point that was lightly touched in our conversation today, and would like to bring it back to the spotlight, is the growing pressure by the US, and especially after the launch of the trade war against China in 2018. This means that despite this push to open China's financial sector, it seems to me that this will be a long process. Despite on the one side, despite allowing more foreign banks and financial institutions to do more to come into China and do more activities here, Chinese leaders are still very cautious about opening the capital account, and instead. The government has been doing controlled experiments, and one, for example, is the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and in our case, in Brazil, the launch of the ETF linked to Ibovespa index back in early 2019, during the visit of our Vice President Mourão here to China. Second is that we still do not know how China will respond to the US financial decoupling. US listed Chinese companies and prevented some US pension funds from investing in China. Then China reacted to this decision. Ambassador Karamuro pointed that, rightly pointed the question if this financial decoupling is a real threat to China in first place, and if it is, what is China going to do about it? So these are the two questions that I would leave for the discussion afterwards on the opening. But the second point on the reforms is that we must discuss China's financial reform in the context of green development and green transition, which are at the heart of this rebalancing of Chinese economy from a growth with quantity model to a growth with quality model that we've seen in the past, at least since 2012. And it's this new model based on quality, driven by high-tech services, driven by environmental sustainability, and also domestic consumption, as it has already been mentioned, the dual circulation, but greater emphasis on domestic consumption to balance the export-led sector of the economy. And for many years, and since at least the mid-1990s, China has been issuing policies and regulations on green finance, but it was only in 2016 that the whole of the Chinese government mobilized to build a green financial system. And since then, China has quickly expanded its green finance sector to become possibly the world's largest, if not the second largest green bond market after the US. And by the end of last year, 2020, China had approximately 12 trillion US dollars in outstanding green loans, which is the highest in the world. And just in the first quarter of this year, 2021, China overtook the US in green bonds with over 15 billion US dollars sold to Chinese issuers. And despite this importance, green finance still accounts for a relatively small proportion of China's financial market. Then the question is, what additional reforms must happen? There has been many talks about issuing special financial support policies for green and local carbon development, and even in China's outgoing investments abroad, and including greening the Belt and Road Initiative, which was already mentioned by Yan. There has been talks about building a unified system for green finance to increase incentives for different agents to invest in green and to promote environmental information disclosure by financial institutions, by enterprises. There have been talks about developing and harmonizing standards to allow for costs to decrease and to accelerate investments in relevant green industries and assets. But again, what does it mean for us in Brazil? I think this is a very important point, as we were discussing with a Brazilian audience, and I cannot prevent myself from recalling the commitments that have been made by Xi Jinping last September at the United Nations to decarbonize the Chinese economy by 2060, peaking emissions by 2030 and fully decarbonizing the economy by 2060. And this movement of green finance and the decarbonization of the Chinese economy can play a really important role in this transition by mobilizing and channeling resources into green technologies, renewable energy efficiency, in all sectors. And this could certainly open trade and investments opportunities, in particular for mega diverse countries like Brazil, in sectors like rare earth elements, like renewable energy, like reforestation, carbon credits, and many others. But it could also mean a decrease in imports and investments in fossil fuels, and especially Brazil being one of the largest exporters of crude oil to China. What could be the implications of these reforms in the green transition in support of China's green development and green transition, and what implications it could have on global trade and investments, and specifically for Brazil? I think this is the second question that I would like to leave for Yan-Lan to react, if possibly. And thank you very, very much once again for the brilliant presentation, Yan-Lan. Over.
Karen, thank you very much for your very interesting and very insightful observations, which enriched here our discussion. I know that we are running against time, and our colleague Mariana, I'm sure, has some questions that she has amassed from the public. So I would propose that if she is here and does have these questions, we would ask 2 questions and then leave some time for Yan-Lan to make her final remarks. Mariana, are you there with some questions?
Yes, and I am here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, Yan-Lan, for your brilliant presentation. Also, Ambassador Karamuru and Karin for their comments. Yan-Lan, based on your presentations, we have some questions that goes in 2 different directions. So I'm going to summarize them in 2 main blocks of subjects. So then I'll leave for your comments. One of them is regarding cybersecurity, how the Chinese banking system is adapting itself to the threats that could come from this going digital tendency and initiative. And the other is about how do you see the potential of destabilizing risks of loosening China's capital account controls? These are the main 2 questions that came. Also some questions about if the Chinese people can trade cryptocurrencies, if the digital currency will be used by China's central bank or not. These are some comments that came from the public, but as Jana mentioned, it's best for us to listen to your comments and to your answers, not only from these questions from the audience, but also your thoughts on Ambassadors Karamuru and Karin's comments. Thank you.
Yan-Lan, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador and Karin, for your excellent observation and the comments. And so I notice you are in fact a specialist about China economic situation, and it's all very relevant comments here. I want to make a few, comments on your observations. First of all, Ambassador mentioned for the Chinese economy today, Chinese government adopt, regulations or measures or policies, either encourage, help small size, medium sized company recovering or withdraw or stop financing, etc. So I just want to let you understand, the public understand how China works. You can notice that in this front, the Chinese government is very pragmatic. We adopt always very pragmatic method to be able to adjust. Maybe so when they need immediately after pandemic exposure, and then in the second quarter, third quarter last year, the Chinese government mobilized financial support for the companies who are heavily affected by the pandemic. But now, since economy resumed, so they want to also to control this potential inflation. And I will come back to this issue later. So I think generally speaking, so the Chinese financial authority, it's not sign a big check immediately. And so it's their attitude, you can see since last year, it's really very major, step by step, and to see what situation happened and what could be the ruling or financial regulation to made. So I always think about for the time being in this sector, so nobody is in front of such a huge challenge as a pandemic situation, as a global situation. So I just resume in the Chinese proverb, it's a touching the stone for cross the river, right? So it's a move step by step and to see what we can get a result and adjust from time to time the physical financial policy to help economic development. So on this dual circulation, it's a very good point. Ambassador mentioned this ODI. Indeed, the ODI, it's a decrease. First of all, due to the pandemic, global pandemic situation. And second of all, I think it is a geopolitical challenge also play a big role in this ODI reducing situation. For example, from my practice, so I advise companies for M&A, cross-border M&A. So we can see very clearly since last year, well, since even 2 years, so Chinese outbound M&A activities, it's decreased due to the uncertainty of pandemic and due to the geopolitical challenge. So, for example, outbound M&A in 2020 decreased to only to the total value of 28 billion. And in 2019, the total value was more than doubled, almost 50 billion USD. So you can see this very rapid decrease of ODI. Of course, so I think it's, but it's interesting to also to come back to this dual circulation policy. That means not stop investment abroad. So due to all this geopolitical challenge, so the Chinese government since last year emphasized the investment focusing abroad, focusing on One Belt, One Road countries, so including Latino America. In my daily work, I got requests from Chinese energy players who are show strong interest to come and to invest, especially in green energy in Brazil, for example, in Latino American in general. So this is an interesting observation. And then whether or not China today make a sort of a competition with the emerging market on attract international capital, I think indeed because of, as you totally right mentioned, so the China economy after pandemic come back with a positive GDP growth, and the international capital always want to go where they can find the safety and they can find the profits, right? So naturally they come to China. Besides, Chinese government emphasize their opening of China financial market, opening market, as Anna mentioned at the very beginning of introduction, reducing the sector in net negative list. That means open much more sector for foreign investment to come to China. But I think, yes, indeed, the fact is for the time being, we see the international capital flows into China market. But I think for the emerging market, the first important thing is to get totally control of the pandemic situation, and then to have a resilient step by gradual economic recovery. And in this case, I think the capital will certainly come back, and also the Chinese capital will come back, in particular, in this emerging market to find their place to cooperation, to investment. So I rather think in this way. And regarding the financial services, it's interesting. I like to say, well, I mean, the regulation concerning the fintech, yes, it's interesting because again, because I used to serve during 20 years as a lawyer, right? So I still remember 40 years ago, at the very beginning of China opening of reform. So what Chinese government was doing, it's have a small, have a pilot project in Shenzhen, it's example, in Shanghai, free trade zone, and test regulations and to see whether or not it can be applicable, what is the result, what's the negative or positive side, before they promulgate into at national level. So, but in fintech, indeed, I think since the last 5 years, even more, Chinese government gave totally freedom to this high-tech company to develop a fintech sector. Of course, only now they notice the high risk of leverage by using their platform by lending, micro lending issue. So they seize the Ant group as an example. We in Chinese proverb saying it's kill the chicken to show to the monkeys. Gave a lesson. Excuse me. And so now it's a stop, but I think it's necessary for the central government. Excuse me. to get control of the get surveillance on this large scale unlimited loan. So they said, okay, you're a fintech company, but if you're doing lending, banking activities, you have to follow the banking regulation. That means you have to have X% of deposit, like I mentioned in my presentation. So Ambassador is totally right to say the China fintech development gave a lesson you can take a takeaway. It's to how to minimize the risks, certain risks of leverage, etc. So you'd better to set up rules which can guide the development of the fintech business. To setting up the rules, maybe start by trial, by pilot projects, pilot rules, and to see whether or not we can work, right? So it's my comments on that. Excuse me, it's not COVID cough. I got 2 vaccination already. So Karen also gave excellent summary and observation on green tech, green finance. I think she gave already a whole picture to the audience. I cannot add more, but I think this transition, since Chinese government set a goal to 2030, it will be the carbon peak, and 2060 will be carbon neutral. So they will mobilize all they can, in particular using the financial tool, green financial tool, to develop, encourage, make green loans by financial guidance, oriented investment in green technology, energy saving, renewable industry sector. So this is what I can see. It's quite very heavy work. I mean, heavy mission, because China, as you know, during the 40 years, so China sacrificed the environment to develop industry, etc. But now, since more than, less than 10 years, Chinese government realized this big and urgent issue, which is environmental protection. We need to solve all these pollution issues and encourage this green energy development. I think we will be there because I already see some very heavy, serious sanctions for polluters in China. Once I met, a few months ago, I met a CEO of a big, great state-owned company. He said they have a mine in the forests, in the national park in the north. And so Chinese Environmental Bureau came, they said they ordered to close the mine within 3 days. He said, oh, I have more than 1,000 or 2,000 workers. But they said the environmental protection is much more important. And of course, you have to take good care of your workers. But the mine, you don't have any extension possible. You have to close within 3 days. You can see the draconian major imposed by the Chinese government for the pollution issue. And so I convinced and I believe this green transaction in China it's already happened, and it will going toward the reach out the goal that Chinese government announced. Yeah. So to answer very quickly for cybersecurity, so the Chinese banks, Chinese regulators, PBOC, have also the regulation on that. And they are very alert on this issue. And regarding the digital currency, the Chinese citizen can also, I have friends, they are invested in cryptocurrency also. So I think it's not the same usage for Chinese renminbi, a digital currency. It's equal to physical renminbi, right? Replaced by the digital way. It's as I mentioned, cost saving, efficiency, etc., etc. But what is important, as Ambassador also mentioned, I want to come back, how this digital currency, e-renminbi, can be used, can be accepted internationally, can promote internationalization of renminbi. This is a big question today for me. I think we also, as I said, in the world, a lot of 80% of central banks are thinking to, or very soon, to use the pilot project for digital currency of their own country. So today it's not their discussion about digital currency. It's not if, but it's about when we will use it, when we can apply it. So it needs also an international standard, an international agreement, I think, in certain sense, to be able to allow all this digital currency to how they can use in what is the international standard which should apply to this digital currencies of every major countries. This is the next step. I cannot answer today, but it's definitely, it's urgent, immediate, should be an urgent topic for research and for international central banks, the central banks of different countries to get agree upon.
Yan Lang, thank you so very much for ending up with also these provocative talks, an international agreement on digital currencies, which speaks very much to many of the topics that we research here in CEBRI. I want to thank all of you for participating in this debate tonight, and especially my friend Yan Lang for such a brilliant presentation. It's not every day that we have a chance to discuss these topics. So it's really a treat for us. And we look forward to your next coming to CEBRI and with new questions. So thank you once again, all of you, and good evening and good morning to all. And on behalf of CEBRI, my heartful thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone to join our discussion. Thank you, Ambassador and Karen. Thank you, CEBRI. I'm looking forward to come back to join you physically.
Very good.
In Brazil.
And we look forward to that. Okay, thank you then. Good night to all.